Today's episode, the team discussed the BBC resignations and whether the BBC is still a trusted voice in British journalism. We also, as a team, share our output. How do we curate news? Where do we get our news from? And how do we process information, both in podcasts and online? And most importantly, we end on the importance of being good news people in a polarised world. Hope you enjoy the episode.
Well, hello and welcome to Cross Section. On this episode, we are looking at all things media, and probably at the core of that, can we trust the BBC? But lots of different aspects to that, and I am joined by our regulars in the London studio. First to you, Alicia, good morning and welcome.
Good morning, Peter. Morning.
And Danny.
Good morning, great to be here.
Well, that's good. I'm glad one of you is glad to be here. We, like the BBC, are here to inform, to educate and to entertain. But first off, on a lighter note, the Celebrity Traitors final. Who was closest to being accurate in their prediction?
Well, I didn't predict because I've not been watching it. So, yeah, definitely not me. I think, pains to say it, you were more right, Peter, than you usually are. But yeah.
I was very wrong. I wasn't on last week, but my prediction was very wrong. I just couldn't see how the faithful lost from the position they were in. But that was my assumption, that Nick and Joe were tight, and I thought they'd stick together. But then Nick blew it all.
So if you're not in the UK, or if you, for some reason, don't have a TV, and aren't aware, this has been the biggest show in the UK in recent weeks, a BBC blockbuster hit, Celebrity Traitors. Well, I think it's fair to say it's had viewing numbers that are really sensational. It's the closest thing to a water cooler moment recently. It feels like where nearly everybody was watching it and watching it kind of live as it went out week by week rather than binge watching. And I had a range of celebrities. And towards the end, Joe Marler, former rugby player, looked like he'd cracked the whole thing and got voted out by his new best mate, Nick Mohammed, the comedian and actor. And the faithful somehow blew what looked like an unassailable kind of position in the programme. Zana, I think, was thoroughly wrong too in her prediction last week. I think it's just appropriate that I say that because she has no right of reply. She's sitting in the studio watching that, and we'll get her revenge by clipping something ridiculous that I say, as she does every week, if she can. Anything else to say about the Traitors? Danny, you were probably the most engaged.
Well, like apart from the final showdown, which, as I say, I was surprised how it turned out. I really didn't think the Traitors were gonna walk away with it, and Alan Carr did. One of the things that's really interested me is that there's been quite a lot of discussion about the visibility of the charities. Alan Carr named very briefly, I think he actually named the charity or the area that they worked in right at the end. But actually the visibility of the charities that all the other participants were taking part on behalf of, who were trying to win the £87,500, they weren't there. So there's been quite a lot of talk about, should there be more visibility for these charities, either just in a little caption when their name was on the screen or a short video after they'd been kicked out. There was a bit of interesting chat about if it was part of the actual kind of dynamic in the castle. Would it be weird that, we can't kill them because we're going to take money away from starving children or people dying of leukemia? I don't think that would make sense, but actually some visibility would be worth far more to those charities than the actual prize money.
What was the winning charity in the end? Or did we still not?
Neuroblastoma, I believe.
Yeah, okay.
A children's neuroblastoma.
Okay.
And the reason it read it, because my dad had something linked with that, but it was interesting. It was a children's one that Alan Carr mentioned, but it was literally, we even said we need to go back because as a family, what was that? It sounded like something we've heard of. But it was just so passing, so fleeting, which was a shame, given the BBC actually do quite a lot of good things for charity with some of their fundraising events. And it is to the BBC we're going to turn. Danny, sorry, you were going to come in.
I wasn't.
No,
I wasn't.
Oh, just my delayed reaction there. We are turning to the BBC and all things media. It has been, again, we are recording on, maybe it's Tuesday morning. Let's say it is the 11th. It is, in fact, the 11th of November, Tuesday morning. And the headlines are absolutely dominated by all things BBC. We do know we have listeners outside the UK. So if you're not right up to speed, the Director General, the head honcho at the BBC, Tim Davie, has stepped down. Deborah Turnes, who was the head of news, which is essentially the second most senior position, I think, really in the BBC, has resigned. A series of things have led to that. Probably the thing that brought it right to the head was a Panorama documentary which edited a speech by President Trump just before the January the 6th riots, and took 2 clips from 50 minutes apart and put them together, and which fundamentally changed the nature of what he was saying and made it look like he was very actively encouraging acts of violence on January the 6th. Whereas when you see the originals, I wouldn't call it a classic speech, but nonetheless, it was misrepresented in how it was edited together. Now, many of us have been on the receiving end of that. I once made a statement outside the Supreme Court following a court ruling, and I gave them a single sentence, and they managed to clip it in 3 different parts and reorder it. But it's all about whether the meaning was changed. And there is a deeper memo behind that. Michael Prescott, who is part of the Editorial Guidelines Committee, I think it is, produced a memo around a number of key issues. We're going to come to those, but it's Trump and the US election in general. It was Gaza, and particularly how BBC Arabic were responding to that. It was sex and gender, and then a number of other issues around race and representation on the BBC. So, Danny, you're first up on this one. The BBC, can we trust it? But more fundamentally, I suppose, just a little bit more of the background of how we've got to this point where really the BBC is in a fairly significant crisis.
It's a huge crisis for the BBC. And one of the challenging questions is, does the resignation of key figures, do all these revelations help to restore trust, or do they just reinforce the problem that people don't trust the BBC as much as they used to? And I say as much because the BBC will still be one of the most trusted sources of news, one of the most trusted institutions in the UK. And when you compare it to other bodies, other organisations, other categories, whether it's politicians, estate agents, church leaders, the BBC comes out really high. It is still very well trusted. But there are these ongoing questions and concerns, and you've heard it for years. People on the right will accuse the BBC of being too left-wing. People on the left will accuse them of being too right-wing. And I think on the party political aspect of it, I think that is just part of the push and pull of both politics and the coverage of politics. I think it's where there seems to be this question of, is there a systemic bias within the BBC that means they intentionally, or at least consistently, even if it's not kind of done consciously, but if they are consistently misrepresenting or presenting issues with a certain frame or a certain perspective to the detriment of other perspectives, then that's a problem. Whether it's an ingrained liberal mindset, whether it's a postmodern, post-everything bias, is there a framework where kind of this is the way we do things around here? The culture is such that these things keep on happening. And then the question is, well, how do you change that? How do those sorts of things change? And that's a really tough job.
That's a big question, I think. So one of the arguments I found reasonably compelling was the BBC tends to employ a relatively young and educated workforce in the cities, and that will lead you to employ people who are then on the spectrum more likely to be liberal, just in terms of from the educational and from the city kind of demographic perspective, and that is almost undoubtedly the case. So, I mean, I suppose, Alicia, a question for you around that, but like, is the BBC biased? Do you think it can manage this impartiality brief that it's designed to have?
I think they all manage it with great difficulty. I mean, we're talking about it on Tuesday, but actually the story really broke last Thursday. That was when I was kind of listening to the Daily Telegraph kind of announcing their kind of shock revelation and investigation around this. And for 4 days, I think what I've been deeply surprised by is how there's been 2 dual narratives coming out of the BBC. One, it was an error and a mistake, and we'll come back to language. Is it mistake or is it deception? And then the other is that this is actually the centre-right of British media wanting to bring down the BBC. And a lot of commentators have really pushed back on that. And for me, I'm struggling to understand how, particularly within the BBC, take the Panorama story, the Trump piece. I'm flabbergasted that they would call that an editorial error, that you've taken and snipped 2 parts together to curate a different meaning. Now, the whole speech is available, and what happened on the 6th was a catastrophe in the sense of American politics and all that came out from that. But I think the BBC has a responsibility to accurately report and not just present that they're wanting to present to their Panorama listeners a view on what took place on January the 6th. And I think there's a lot of trying to hide the seriousness of this or downplay the seriousness of what's going on. And for me, you're a journalistic output that has huge influence on UK's understanding of global and cultural events. And Trump, gender identity, we'll talk about abortion, we'll talk about all these different issues. It always leans preferentially to the centre-left and not engaging different points of view on the same topic in a healthy way. And I think that is problematic. There's definitely a reform element that needs to happen with the BBC. It's not simply just replacing two people. These two people represent a culture. There are staff members that were responsible for those editorial decisions who didn't think there was anything in error in snipping and bringing those two together along with other news stories. So I think there's a cultural issue within the BBC in terms of its journalistic output that is concerning for me.
I think just specifically on the Panorama documentary, one of the defences that Nick Robinson, presenter on the Radio 4 Today programme, made was that there hadn't been any complaints about it at the time of its broadcast. The complaints have all come subsequent to the revelations last week. And I was thinking about, well, what actually happened? I think there are three scenarios, and I think I know which one was probably the most likely. One was, it was a total accident, totally unintentional. They just made a mistake. It wasn't any malice, any intent.
Mm-hmm.
It just happened. I don't think that happened. The other is that they set out to say, right, we're going to intentionally deceive. Mm. We are going to change the meaning of what President Trump said in order to convey this. What I think the most likely scenario is that they said, well, they internally, or I say they, the producers, whoever was doing this, had this idea that Donald Trump was whipping up people to go to the Capitol to cause a riot. And therefore they felt that the editing of the speech was a fair representation of what he said. Mm. And therefore, by putting those two pieces together, it was a fair representation of the whole speech, even though, well, they were 54 minutes apart. They were in two totally different sections. Mm-hmm. I can't say I've listened to the whole thing, although I did listen to more of it at the time. And I think it's that kind of attitude where you go into a story or a situation with a preconceived idea of what is happening or what the story is. Yeah. And therefore, well, this is the narrative. This is what's going on. And therefore, this is what we want to convey. And that is where that kind of liberal bias, that mindset comes in, because you think you already know what it is you're trying to convey, rather than letting the facts and the situations tell their own story.
So I think for me, the Trump and the Gaza stuff is really important, and Michael Prescott's memo has highlighted issues, but the one that was the most clear was the sex and gender stuff, because it was something we had talked about as an organisation. I in particular had an interest in, and I think it's just really clear cut there that they had a particular agenda. They weren't running any stories. So you've got the Waypath files, as they were called, this revelation that globally medical bodies were trying to squash any kind of stories around this, and we had a very particular lens on that. The BBC, when those files were released, there was a kind of big data dump, didn't cover it. The Darlington nurses, just even in the last week or two, barely any coverage. And again, Michael Prescott raised that. I mean, it's a very significant case, and the BBC just weren't interested. And then it kind of came to a little bit of a mini head just before this with Martine Cruxell, the news presenter who was had this auto cue some time ago. This was initially pregnant people was on the auto cue. She changed it to women as she was doing it, because it was, I think rightly, she thought it was a mistake, and then she has been reprimanded for the eye roll, which seems to me staggering. I think that's the one where he's highlighted there's an LGBT desk that was deciding what stories went through and what did not, and that I think was the clearest example for me of bias.
And I think one of the areas here, and one of the journalists that did take a different approach, was Hannah Barnes. She was a Newsnight journalist. She was on the New Statesman podcast this week talking about the BBC and all this crisis. And they have changed the way they operate. So Newsnight pull now from teams of reporters that work across the whole BBC. So you have an LGBT desk that provides the content for all these stories. And therefore, rather than Newsnight doing their own reporting on these stories, they now go to this desk, which I would say inevitably has a particular perspective and a particular approach. So rather than doing original reporting on stories that relate to sexuality or gender, they go to a desk of people that have a particular approach. I think one of the things I find most interesting about all of this is, what do we actually mean by impartiality? So for us as a charitable organisation, for us as a organisation of Christians, we represent evangelicals who support a wide range of political parties. So we are impartial when it comes to party politics, but we are decidedly not impartial on some issues. We have a position, we have a perspective, and we speak from that perspective. So we're impartial party politically, but we're not impartial in other ways. For the BBC to be impartial across the board asks a huge amount. And this is why I actually think it's an impossible task, because editorial decisions require making decisions about what news is more important than other news. It's not like when news happens, it immediately is like, okay, this is the top story. And objectively, that's obvious. Sometimes, yes, that is clear. But it takes decisions. Which news stories do you profile? How do you cover them? How long do you run with stories? What questions do you ask about stories? Which guests do you have on to discuss those stories? Do you permit multiple points of debate on an issue, or do you present something as the settled position? All of those are editorial decisions. And that, frankly, requires bias. It requires decision-making to happen. So if you're in a print media, yeah, that's accepted. Print media in the UK has a perspective. So when I read the Times and when I read the Guardian, when I read the Daily Mail, I know that they are coming at a story from a particular position. I think the fallacy with the BBC is that it presents this idea that it doesn't have a position. And it might have multiple positions. It might not always be clear what that position is, but you are simply making a decision by choosing what stories you're putting on news. So I think we need to think a bit more about what we actually want from the BBC and what we expect from them, because otherwise we'll be asking them to fulfill an impossible task.
I mean, for me, I hear the impartiality and the challenge with that. I mean, the relationship being, the government minister, culture secretary is in charge of appointing who the chairperson is of the BBC. There's a direct link to government and all of that sort of thing. But I think this is about integrity. I think that the BBC, British Broadcasting Company, has become and was an incredible institution that did incredible investigative journalism that went into, a whole range of different issues. I remember as young, being a politics student, World Service was something that I would refer to often as kind of learning alongside all my degree and state around the world. And I trusted it deeply. I say, but the problem we now have is I do think the BBC has a very strong leaning, and also in this story, a double standard. If this was practiced by GB News, they would coming out in uproar in the sense of that there's a slicing and splicing of GB News on, say, the Prime Minister or the Chancellor or whomever of left-leaning, Zach Polanski. They would be saying that's poor journalism, that's not the standard that we require, and actually you're putting our profession in disrepute. The BBC is a deeply influential institution in terms of news, in terms of it's one of many, but in terms of how it speaks out. And they're not just speaking on non-issues that, doesn't impact. They're talking about the issue and position of issues of Israel and Gaza, the Middle East, gender identity, all these cultural conversations, Trump, goodness me, that have been deeply divisive in global politics as well as national. And I just think there's a carelessness whereby integrity, and I think the thing I'm most annoyed about, 4 days they've had to get ahead of this story and to own it and to say it was a mistake and we're sorry. They're kind of holding out on the apology of this because they're kind of like, well, this is journalistic, the way that we do it. I'm like, this is problematic. There's an issue. A mistake would be we put the wrong time, or the mistake is we've sliced and spliced 54 minutes and put them together. That's a mistake. But they're not owning the mistake, and therefore there was intention and it's deceptive, and you need to own that. I think that's the part that I'm just surprised by.
I think not recognising the scale of the problem is the problem. I think not recognising that this was such a big deal for a week is the problem. that they thought, I think, perhaps last week, that they could just write
Keep
this out and it
everyone
wouldn't be a problem. And it only been in the last couple of days that it was apparent that they weren't going to be able to do that now. President Trump has issued them with a legal letter threatening to sue for $1 billion. So I think, not recognising the problem and not recognising the scale of the problem is actually the problem.
I think there's real challenges then for the BBC. We have, all of us engaged, been on the BBC, probably Danny and I a little bit more. Okay, Alicia hasn't. I thought you'd done some media. Danny has been a regular. I've been a regular on the BBC. So I think it's probably helpful for our listeners to understand that we have, I certainly can say, I think there is bias and a lack of neutrality on certain issues, but I also recognise that I'm somebody who's been on the BBC despite or because of the views that I hold. Even this last week, was asked to do something around Christian nationalism, but then the journalist was saying, actually, we can't get the right mix of people because they're trying to meet their impartiality criteria. And because of where it was being recorded, which of the national BBCs was coming out of, they needed somebody from that nation. They needed different representation, and therefore they couldn't get the right mix of people. So I want to say their task often is an unenviable one. It's incredibly difficult to get the mix that they're required to have. But also I have spoken regularly on abortion, and we have challenged BBC News around this directly, both in Northern Ireland and UK-wide. And they're very clear that they will always introduce somebody like me as anti-abortion and somebody on the other side of the debate as pro-choice. We've asked them why it's not pro-life and pro-choice. We think that's a fair set of markers, or no identifying marker. Just introduce us as the people in our organisations and let us frame it ourselves. They have declined to do both of those. They saw, I was with the head of News Northern. They could see no problem with what they were doing. They thought it was perfectly reasonable to describe us as anti-abortion. And so part of the reason we have our Both Lives campaign is because it immediately reframes that when you're introduced. But the framing there, and in a number of areas, they have a very set ideological agenda. There are lots of other areas where they're great and they bring us in and we get to be part of the conversation. But I've been in conversations that were stacked, 2-on-1, 3-on-1, where the presenter clearly wasn't neutral while trying to hold an impartiality line. But I have been in all those conversations. We have good working relationships with many BBC journalists. Our public leadership programme goes into the BBC buildings and we engage with them as other stakeholders do. So I personally am quite passionate about public service broadcaster. I think it's broadly a good thing. I think 85% of what the BBC does is actually really good, like Celebrity Traitors. But I also think a lot of their other content's good. And we're going to talk in a minute about what each of us do in terms of how we get our news. But I do think 15% of it, or whatever the number is problematic. And 5% of that is actually deeply problematic and deeply kind of oriented in particular directions. And I think the conversation has shifted a bit on that too, because a lot more people, the BBC used to get essentially a pass, I think, for a long time. And there's a lot more pushback and it has become a lot more politicized.
I think one of the things that I've recognised from being on BBC, being on the radio, being very occasionally on the TV, is just some of the process of determining, as Peter said, who's on. I've had calls with producers where I think it's gone pretty well. I've had pretty good feedback, and then actually no, they've gone with someone else. Sometimes that's because they want to go for a more extreme voice. And I've even learned the lesson of actually not over nuancing what you're saying in the pre-call with the producers. Like, you can be a bit more nuanced when you actually get on air, but be clear about your position. But also, I've also lost out because I don't have a dog collar. Like, and that's one of the strange things, is the privileging of the Church of England. If you're a bishop, or if you've even got a dog collar, that kind of, for some reason, because maybe it's the visual, maybe it's the Church of England, they're like, oh, we'll have that person on because they're a vicar, over and above what they might say. And I think that's one of the things that actually just fails to recognise the diversity of Christianity in the UK. And I think it's one of the challenges that will be up ahead as, frankly, the Church of England becomes less significant in UK Christianity and other churches become more significant. So I think being able to hear that diversity of voices will be important for the BBC.
I think you're absolutely right. We haven't even touched on the religious programming, who gets on Thought for the Day, who doesn't. Again, one of our colleagues is on regularly on Radio 2, but Danny, you and I probably both would tend to do a live interview if we get the choice, because again, it can't be cut and we have more control over what we're saying. So there's lots more we could say about that and how we as Christians engage directly in that space. I do want to ask you guys a little bit, how do we respond to this, in the sense of how do you get your news? How do you process? You both, in varying ways, are kind of news junkies. We probably consume above average levels of news. So Alicia, do you want to maybe go for like, what does that look like for you, even on a personal level? How do you kind of get your news, do your filtering? How do you think about it?
I think the first thing to start off with is that I'm fully aware, whether they're seeking to be impartial or not, that there is a slant, there's an angle increasingly within broadsheet and within kind of television and kind of podcasting news. I think the nature of my role and just being engaged in politics intensively, I try and touch the left and the right. So things like New Statesman is a kind of a magazine that I'd happily read and purchase alongside their podcasts. And then moving across to the Daily Tea I've already mentioned, and the Telegraph and the Financial Times and the Times and the Economist and all these sorts of things to give, and even the Daily Mirror and the Sun. I think they're very helpful in learning how they reach their audience and their messaging, how you could be having the same breaking news and read across all those spreadsheets, a very different take and angling on that. But then equally, as a person of faith, I'm also very minded that truth might not be at the forefront of any of these journalistic outputs. And so to be very mindful that there's a level of persuasion and influence that is wanting to be had and taken. And also it's also good to not also be steeped in all of these news outlets. Enjoy life, be in creation, have conversations with people who are impacted by different news stories rather than reading a journalistic output on a news story. So there's variation, and depending on my mood, to be honest.
Really helpful. Yeah, no, Danny, what about you in terms of process or how you're doing that?
One of the things I find interesting is how am I engaging with the news versus how are people who are less politically interested engaged in the news. In that my news is primarily social media curated. So actually the links I click, the stories I read are often those that are driven through social media. And I'm aware of the limitations of that. So I will go to the homepages of news websites, whether it's the Times or the BBC or other places. I find the differences of approach really interesting. I will get annoyed with both the Guardian and the Daily Telegraph for their political perspectives on things and where their blind spots are and where their assumptions are. Even just reading about the BBC on both those newspapers this morning, you can see their approach. You can see where their agendas are in relation to both of them. I think podcasts are a significantly increased. So most of my comment and most of my discussion, I would read far fewer kind of comment pieces and discussion pieces now, but I would listen to podcasts. And that would be from Sky News, from the Times, but also other non kind of mainstream commercial podcasts as well. And I think that diversity of perspective is interesting, but I'm a news junkie. So like I asked my wife the other day whether she had any awareness of any of the chat about the upcoming budget. She knew nothing. I asked her about the BBC. She knew nothing. I just want to say that my wife...
She's living life.
Yeah.
Props to you, Haley. Props to you.
We have two small children. She has a busy job. But she's not in the same world. And actually, I was saying this as I switched on the BBC News at 10 intentionally because I wanted to watch what was in the first 10 minutes of the BBC News at 10, because that is actually what most people still, certainly on an older generation, that's how they will get their primary filter of news. It's interesting, we were talking before we went on that I think it's 43% of 18 to 29-year-olds in the States say TikTok is a major source of news for them. We're saying, well, what does that mean? Is it clips that they're watching on TikTok of other news media? Who knows? But yeah, the news environment has changed significantly.
Really helpful again. I think for me, I do tend to, I have the BBC app. I know a few people have said to me, oh, I've got rid of that. I still see it as mostly in the morning. I will look at what the headline stories are. I tend not to click in and read the actual story. I want to see what are the big issues that are sitting at the top. And then I will tend to spend about 10, 15 minutes, usually earlier in the day if I can, going through those headline kind of Times, Guardian, Telegraph, Daily Mail, Belfast Telegraph newsletter, because I want some regional news. And the reason I'm going across those other papers is the different perspectives. As you say, Danny, the Telegraph and the Guardian on this BBC story is just hilarious. It's like it's two radically different stories. And you see people who only post from one of those sources, and it's definitely going to skew them. I think everything has a take, everything has an angle, including the BBC, and it's particular journalists now I'm often interested in going into something like Unheard or Tortoise Media or some of those outlets that will give you a longer form. So I listen to less news podcasts than Danny, I think. I will also click on to Premier News, partly because we're preparing for this. So again, a Christian news story just to see they'll often have more Christian content. Again, we know the guys there, they also have an angle. Everybody's trying to sell more, get more clicks, drive it through. Listen, we do that. It'd be naive to say we don't ever try and get a clip of us making a mistake last week, have some fun with that. A lot of mine comes through social media as well, and you click through. I think it's then how you hold that. I do enjoy the news. There are seasons where I've got almost fed up with it. But how do we navigate some of that as good news people? Because look, we're on Cross Section. We are trying to help you navigate faith and culture. We are probably not going to get to everybody's favorite story about the Christmas ads on this episode. We're going to, Danny, okay, I'll let you have one comment and then I'll wrap things up. Because I don't think Alicia has seen them yet. I barely touched on them. Danny, give us a Christmas ad take for us,
honestly,
and then we'll wrap it up.
It was, Zan and I were talking yesterday about how quick the switchover from Halloween to Christmas had been. The 1st of November rolled around, and all of the Christmas stuff rolled out. The supermarkets had Christmas on their shelves even more than before. The Christmas adverts started hitting the TV. I was just very aware of how quickly that had happened. Whether it's John Lewis talking about father and son, I've noticed Lidl's is around their toy bank trying to tap into, obviously they're advertising the store, but they're also trying to advertise their social agenda as well. Christmas ads, you've got preachers who are looking for what's the Christmas sermon soundbite that they can pull out and use. But it's also interesting just for what it is saying about kind of wider cultural commentary. What are the themes? The Centre for Social Justice have done a lot of work about young adult men and younger men particularly. Well, they found it worthy of commenting on the John Lewis ad and what that was saying. So it is interesting what the shops are doing and what the major brands are doing and who they're trying to appeal to and how they're trying to do that. And yeah, and what is a few years ago, it was quite a few years ago, I got in a bit of hot water about some sausage rolls and Greggs. It's always interesting how many liberties brands are happy to take with Christianity and Christmas.
Don't need to get into hot water. You just made yourself a global sensation with the quote that was picked up by everybody.
Oh, it's 48 hours of craziness. The Wall Street Journal, everyone.
It's Danny's most famous comment. So the John Lewis ad is a father and son one, a little bit of an ode to adolescence, although apparently the idea was before that, but they felt the confirmation when that came through. So something a little bit different in a culture around masculinity and a lot of cost of living stuff. The Asda one, it's got the Grinch. Asda, isn't it? Yes, the green. And then we happened to see that. Maybe it was watching. Obviously, it wasn't Traitors then because it was on BBC. It must have been the Bake Off or something, and it came up because very rarely see an ad as a family, and everybody commented on that this was a much more kind of down to earth moment about a cost friendly Christmas. Yeah, I've been listening to Cross Section. Thank you for joining us again as we've discussed, in particular today, that big story around can you trust the BBC and our media consumption more generally. We are constantly trying to help you navigate that space in terms of faith and culture in this moment. And how do we be good news people in what is often a bad news world? Good News People is the title of a book written by Gav, Calver and Phil. You can pick that up wherever you want. That's a great one. If you sign up to become a member, that's what we'll send you. You can, of course, join us in the Evangelical Alliance. It's £3 a month. Go to the website, click to become a member. And one of the things you will get is either a fantastic book called Being Human by Joe Frost and a guy called Peter Lynas, or if you're really lucky, you'll get Good News People by Gav Calver and Phil Knox. Of course, we don't believe in luck. It'll be providential and the membership team will decide. But with that, I do want to just encourage you as you navigate your news feeds as to how we do, again, reorientate ourselves in this moment, how we center ourselves in what Jesus and God has to say. Again, the importance of that time, just daily in the Word, that time with God and that time in prayer that orientates what we're coming into and preaching this Sunday on Good News People, probably on John 15 and John 17, and Jesus kind of commissioning out of the disciples in that moment. And I do think it is a constant reminder to me, and I hope to all of us, I don't know how, again, people sometimes navigate just so much of what feels like the bad news and the overwhelming and oppressive nature of some of what's going on in our culture. And it just feels like at every turn, that is the thing that sells newspapers, that gets us interested, that gives us the clicks, whether you're getting that through TikTok, whether you're getting that through the TV news at 10 o'clock with Danny sitting with his slippers on, watching it live on a TV, or whether you're getting it through newspaper sources. But reorientating ourselves and remember that what we carry in this moment is the good news. And I just want to encourage you, again, so many conversations I've been having recently and talking to other leaders. People are interested in faith, and they are interested in Christianity. There is a renewed interest right across the UK, and we continue to hear those stories. And even just for ourselves as an organisation, this week, the Lost Boys report, there was an angle of that being taken in Northern Ireland. The team were running that. The junior minister was there. The team in Scotland were on an anti-prostitution bill, and again had government or MSPs there at that gathering. Next week, we'll be launching a Faith in Wales report with the First Minister in Wales, due to be there and helping to launch that report. And this week, we're in all sorts of conversations, including the Interfaith Week, which takes one of us into the kind of Dan Downing Street environment and some of those spaces. So again, we do have this access, and we are so thankful for that. We would value your prayers as Alicia and Danny in particular get to navigate some of those spaces, as well as teams across the nation. And we would love you just to be praying for the team and praying for us as an organisation, and keep listening to Cross Section and spreading the word wherever you can. Like, review, tell other people it's amazing. If you don't like it, tell us and we'll change it up. With that, I will finish my rant to end the show. Thank you for joining us. Be blessed.